Daniel Mercer had always been a man who preferred the quiet company of his own thoughts to the noise of the outside world. And in the years since his wife's death, that tendency had only deepened until his life had become a rhythm of silence and solitude, shaped by the contours of the land he lived on. The house where he spent his days was more than just shelter. It was his final completed project as an architect, a place he and his wife had designed together, brick by brick, sketch by sketch, a structure that embodied their shared taste for simple lines, tall windows that welcomed light, and an almost stubborn refusal to follow the gaudy suburban trends that surrounded them. For Daniel, the home was never merely a building. It was an anchor, a living archive of memories. And every evening when he stepped into the garden and looked across the fields, he saw not only the gentle slopes and oak trees, but also the traces of conversations with his wife about where to plant the orchard, how the sun would fall on the western windows, how the wooden beams would age gracefully with time. When she passed away, those conversations became ghosts, soft echoes that lingered in corners, and Daniel, who had once been an active member of design committees and professional circles, slowly withdrew, preferring instead to maintain the land with his own hands, pruning, repairing, sketching in notebooks not for clients but for himself. Neighbors knew him as quiet but courteous, a man who rarely attended gatherings but was always seen walking the perimeter of his property with tools in hand, ensuring every gate was secured and every fence straight. The property itself was a few acres at the edge of a neighborhood increasingly swallowed by development, where modern houses with identical facades multiplied like reflections in a mirror, each one stamped with the heavy hand of a homeowner's association that prided itself on order and compliance. Daniel's land was an anomaly, a wedge of independence surrounded by manicured conformity, and though he had received letters inviting him to join the HOA, he had always declined, citing legal deeds and boundary records that gave him no obligation to submit. For years, this quiet refusal was tolerated, perhaps even ignored, because he kept to himself, and his land carried the dignity of someone who knew how to defend what was his without raising his voice. The longer he lived this way, the more his life resembled a kind of self-imposed retreat, though not without purpose, because every beam of the house, every stone along the path, and every tree in the yard carried the weight of his wife's absence. He found meaning in preservation, repainting window frames, sanding the porch, adjusting irrigation for the garden. Friends from the past had stopped calling, and Daniel let them fade, not with resentment but with the resigned understanding that grief made him a difficult man to reach. His neighbors, newer and younger, saw him as a figure from another time, polite but distant, almost an old ghost wandering among modern constructions. Yet beneath the silence there was a resilience, a quiet certainty that his land, his home, and his memories were bound together in a way no external force could disrupt. That certainty, however, began to waver the day the black sedan appeared at the edge of his drive, engine idling as the afternoon sun slanted low across the fields. Daniel noticed it first as a shape through the kitchen window, too still to be casual, and when the doors opened and 3 men stepped out, dressed not in the casual wear of neighbors but in dark suits with crisp collars, his first thought was not of friendliness but of intrusion. They carried themselves with a kind of official posture, the way men do when they want to be mistaken for authority, and as they approached his gate, Daniel felt the familiar stir of unease that comes when strangers enter a place that has long been private. He wiped his hands on a cloth, steadying himself with the same calm he used when facing unexpected flaws in blueprints, and stepped outside, meeting them with a measured politeness that barely concealed his suspicion. One of the men raised a folder and announced they were inspectors from the local homeowners association, claiming they had been sent to review his property for compliance. Their words were smooth, practiced, but Daniel's eyes caught the details that did not fit. The edges of the identification cards that looked as though they had been laminated too recently, the faint blurring of the seal as if copied from a low-quality printer, and, most of all, the arrogance in their tone, as though they had already decided he was in violation before stepping onto his land. Daniel asked calmly why they were there, reminding them that his property did not fall under HOA jurisdiction, but the man's reply was sharp, carrying a weight not of inquiry but of demand. "Boundaries shift," he said with a smirk that did not reach his eyes, "and rules evolve. You've been outside them long enough." It was then, in that moment, as the late sun caught the polished shoes of the so-called inspectors and cast long shadows across the gate, that Daniel realized the peace he had built around himself was about to be tested in ways he had never anticipated, and the solitude he had once cherished would become both his weapon and his vulnerability. Daniel had always believed that if you kept your head down, respected your neighbors, and defended your property with quiet dignity, you could live without interference, but the days following the strange encounter at his gate began to chip away at that belief in ways he could not ignore. At first he convinced himself it was an isolated incident, perhaps some misguided attempt by overzealous association members to intimidate him into joining. Yet the longer he replayed their words in his mind, the more he recognized the calculated tone, the precision of their phrasing, and the unmistakable air of men who were not improvising but following a script. They had not come to ask, they had come to declare, and when he refused them entry, their expressions had not turned to frustration or even surprise. Instead, they had carried a subtle satisfaction, as though his resistance had been predicted and served a purpose he could not yet see. 2 days later, as the pale morning light stretched across the gravel drive, Daniel stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper and saw a manila envelope tucked neatly into the wrought iron gate, placed with care, not tossed like junk mail. He carried it inside, sat at the oak kitchen table that had once been crowded with sketches and coffee mugs when his wife was alive, and opened it with the same deliberate precision he applied to any set of architectural plans. Inside lay a set of documents that at first glance bore all the hallmarks of legality: letterhead embossed with an official seal, neatly typed sections citing statutes and regulations, signatures that mimicked the cursive confidence of practiced bureaucrats. The notice claimed his property was subject to review for multiple violations, including non-conforming structures and unauthorized land use, terms broad enough to encompass anything and everything, yet vague enough to evade immediate challenge. Most disturbing of all was the final page, which informed him that unless corrective action was taken, his land would be subject to fines escalating into foreclosure. Daniel read the pages slowly, each sentence sinking into him with the weight of something both absurd and terrifying. He had no unauthorized structures. Every shed, every extension, every modification had been built with his own hands, measured against deeds and permits older than many of the houses now standing in the neighborhood. Yet the language of the notice was crafted to erode certainty, to imply inevitability. He turned to the signatures, and there it was again. The same peculiar detail he had noticed on the cards of the men at his gate. The names were different, but the pen strokes bore an uncanny similarity, as though written by one hand imitating several. He leaned back in his chair, the envelope spread across the table, and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. This was not negligence or a clerical mistake. It was deliberate fabrication, a counterfeit draped in the guise of law, and it carried with it the unmistakable message that someone, somewhere, had decided his land was no longer his to keep. That evening, as the sun descended and shadows stretched long across the fields, he stood by the fence line and watched a familiar black sedan crawl slowly down the road, headlights dim, its presence both casual and deliberate. It did not stop, but the driver turned his head just enough for Daniel to catch the glint of eyes assessing him through the glass. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, only the quiet passing of a vehicle that had no business being there, a silent reminder that he was being watched. He thought of calling the police, but he knew too well how such matters unfolded. Without concrete evidence of trespass or assault, his complaints would be filed away as paranoia, especially against a homeowners association that often cloaked itself in the language of community welfare. The following morning, Daniel found another envelope, this time slipped directly into his mailbox without postage, a clear violation of federal law, but one that underscored the arrogance of whoever was orchestrating the harassment. This letter was sharper, less restrained in its threats. It cited an outstanding balance of $15,000 in unpaid HOA dues, a figure both impossible and absurd given his long-established independence from the association. The document demanded immediate payment under threat of further enforcement, and while the phrasing avoided specifics, the menace was undeniable. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he folded the papers, not from fear alone, but from a rising fury at the brazenness of the lies. He had kept every deed, every boundary survey, every correspondence proving his exemption, yet here he was being cornered by shadows who dressed their theft in the appearance of authority. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat in the living room, surrounded by shelves of blueprints and framed photographs of the life he had once shared, and listened to the creaks of the house settling in the dark. Each sound carried with it the possibility of intrusion, and his mind replayed the words one of the men had spoken at the gate. "You've been outside long enough." It was not a phrase of inspection, nor of compliance. It was a phrase of judgment, the kind uttered by those who had already decided the outcome. By the early hours of the morning, he resolved to act, to gather his documents, to speak with a lawyer, to build a defense as carefully as he had once built the structures from stone and timber. Yet, as he rose from the chair and glanced out the window, he caught sight of headlights flaring at the end of the lane before disappearing into the night, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him. The men would be back, and next time they would not come merely with words and papers. When dawn broke, Daniel walked his land with the measured steps of a man preparing for siege. He checked locks, inspected fences, and tightened the bolts on the gate. Small rituals that lent him a sense of control, even as he knew the forces gathering against him were less concerned with physical boundaries than with erasing the very rights he had spent his life preserving. The catalyst had arrived not with fire or violence, but with paper, ink, and the silent pressure of men who believed intimidation would be enough to bend him. Yet Daniel Mercer, widower, architect, and guardian of the land that carried his wife's memory, felt something stir in him that he had not felt in years. A stubborn resolve. The same tenacity that once carried him through sleepless nights drafting structures others swore could not be built. They wanted his land, his home, his sanctuary. They would learn soon enough that he was not a man who surrendered easily. Daniel's decision to resist the encroaching pressure from the so-called inspectors carried with it a heavy weight, and as the days passed he began to sense that his refusal had not discouraged them, but instead invited a sharper, more deliberate kind of response. The morning after he had secured his gates and gathered his documents, he drove into town to retrieve copies of deeds and tax records from the county office, determined to reinforce his defenses not with weapons or alarms, but with irrefutable evidence of his ownership. Yet when he returned home in the fading light, he found the black sedan once again waiting at the edge of his drive, positioned deliberately at an angle that blocked his entrance. The men did not step out immediately. Instead, they remained seated, doors closed, windows rolled up, as if testing how long it would take before Daniel approached. He sat behind the wheel of his truck, heart beating steadily but not frantically, and waited until the silence stretched unbearable before finally climbing out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. One of the men emerged then, the same tall figure with slicked-back hair who had spoken most often during their first encounter. He carried a folder in his hand, not the thin manila of ordinary paperwork, but a thick black binder embossed with a cheap imitation of a legal insignia. He walked with the careful steps of someone accustomed to authority, or at least to pretending at it, and when he reached the gate he did not ask permission but simply rested his hand upon the latch as though it already belonged to him. "Mr. Mercer," he said in a voice that carried across the quiet evening. "We gave you an opportunity to cooperate. You've chosen instead to resist, and that puts us all in a difficult position." Daniel folded his arms, standing just beyond the gate, refusing to step closer. The man opened the binder and produced a stack of papers clipped together, sliding them through the narrow space between the bars. "These are amended notices," he continued, reflecting the most recent determinations. Non-compliant structures, unauthorized grading of land, environmental violations. Each carries a penalty, and combined they amount to a significant debt. But debts can be resolved quickly, provided you sign. Daniel scanned the top page and felt the heat rise in his chest. The name printed at the top was not his own, but that of someone else entirely. Robert Hale, a stranger, perhaps invented, perhaps a shell, yet the address and parcel number belonged to him. The strategy became clear. They were not merely trying to fine him, but to reassign ownership altogether, to weave a false record that would one day be presented as fact. He lifted his eyes to the man and said with a calm he did not entirely feel, "That is not my name, and this is not your land to take." The man's expression did not falter. He simply closed the binder, tapped it once against his palm, and replied, "Names can be corrected. What matters is that you are standing on property already flagged for reassignment. If you want to avoid further trouble, you will sign before this goes any further." The standoff stretched long, broken only by the low hum of the sedan's engine and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Daniel did not move. Finally, the man shrugged as though disappointed but unsurprised and returned to the car. As the vehicle reversed down the lane, Daniel felt a chill that was not from the evening air. He had not been asked to comply, he had been instructed, and his refusal had been marked. Later that night, unable to sleep, Daniel sat at his drafting table reviewing the false documents by lamplight, noting each irregularity, each reference to outdated statutes, each inconsistency in signatures. He began cataloging them in a notebook, creating an archive as meticulous as any set of architectural plans, because he understood now that this was not a matter to be resolved with a single confrontation, but a campaign, and campaigns required records, strategies, and patience. Yet, even as he worked, his concentration was broken by the sudden flare of headlights sweeping across his windows. He rose and moved silently to the front door, peering out through the narrow gap in the curtain. The sedan had returned, parked further down the road this time, engine idling, its occupants silhouettes against the glow of the dashboard. They did not approach, did not knock, did not call out. They simply sat in the dark, watching. After a long hour, the engine cut, the lights extinguished, and the night returned to silence, though Daniel knew the silence carried with it the presence of men who had not gone far. The following morning brought a new escalation. As he opened his mailbox, he found not an envelope, but a bright yellow notice affixed directly to the metal, stamped with the words, "Final Warning." The language inside was harsher than before, stripped of even the pretense of civility. It stated in blunt terms that failure to comply would result in immediate enforcement, though again it offered no specific mechanism. The threat lay not in the details, but in the deliberate vagueness, designed to unsettle, to imply forces greater than one man could resist. Daniel folded the notice carefully, slid it into his growing archive, and stood at the end of the drive scanning the street for signs of the sedan. It was not there, yet the absence did not bring comfort. He knew now that their presence could no longer be measured by sight alone. That afternoon, as he walked the perimeter of his land, checking once more the strength of his fences, he noticed a section where the soil had been disturbed, as though someone had knelt and pressed documents into the earth. Digging lightly with his boot, he uncovered a small plastic sleeve containing yet another set of papers. This time not notices, but a map, stamped with a faint watermark he could barely decipher. His land was circled in red ink, alongside several neighboring parcels, each marked with names he did not recognize. At the bottom, scrawled in hurried handwriting, were the words, Phase 1. Daniel held the map in his hands, the afternoon wind whipping at the corners, and understood with a clarity that tightened his chest. He was not the only target. What he faced was part of a larger design, a scheme that reached beyond his fences, beyond his orchard and fields, into the lives of neighbors who perhaps did not yet know the storm coming for them. By the time dusk fell again, Daniel's resolve had hardened. The first escalation had arrived not with violence, but with methodical intimidation. False documents, invented names, threats delivered with the calm arrogance of men convinced of their inevitable victory. Yet Daniel Mercer had spent his life proving the impossible possible, raising structures where others saw only empty lots, holding lines where others bent. They had expected an easy surrender, but what they would find instead was resistance as deliberate and unyielding as stone. Daniel had always believed that architecture was not only about designing spaces but about understanding the forces that pressed against them, the stresses and loads, the invisible currents of weight and pressure that could topple a building if ignored. And as he stared at the growing archive of counterfeit documents and the ominous map pulled from the soil near his fence, he began to view his life through the same lens, a fragile structure braced against the pressure of men who sought to unmake it. The threats no longer arrived only at his gate or in his mailbox, but in subtler, more insidious ways, and he began to notice how the atmosphere of his days had shifted, the phone ringing once and then cutting off into silence, the faint crunch of footsteps beyond his window at night, the smell of cigarette smoke drifting across the orchard when no one he knew smoked in years. He recorded everything, not as a man trapped in paranoia, but as an architect gathering evidence of a structural flaw before it collapsed into ruin. Yet the breakthrough he needed did not come from his own vigilance alone, but from a figure he had long underestimated, Martha Klein, his neighbor to the north. She was a widow in her late 60s who had lost her husband, Leonard, a decade earlier, and though they exchanged polite greetings when their paths crossed, Daniel had always assumed she preferred her solitude as fiercely as he did. It was therefore unexpected when one late afternoon, as he stood tightening a section of wire fence along the orchard, she appeared at the edge of his property carrying a battered cardboard box in her arms. She called out softly, her voice carrying over the hum of cicadas, and asked if he had a moment to talk. Daniel, wary by habit now, nodded cautiously, and she crossed onto his land with the slow determination of someone who had made a difficult decision. Inside the box was an assortment of files, folders, and notebooks, clearly aged and yellowed by time, and Martha explained in a quiet, deliberate tone that her late husband had been a lawyer who, before his health failed, had handled several disputes, with the very homeowners association now pressing against Daniel. Leonard had grown suspicious of the organization's methods years ago, noting patterns of selective enforcement and strange transfers of property, and though he never had the chance to pursue the matter in court, he had kept meticulous notes, perhaps anticipating that one day those files might serve someone else. She pushed the box gently toward Daniel and said, almost apologetically, that she had thought of burning it after Leonard's death, but something in her had resisted, and seeing the black sedan parked by Daniel's property had awakened the sense that now was the time to pass it on. That evening, Daniel spread the contents across his drafting table, and what he found turned his unease into grim certainty. There were copies of old HOA bylaws, annotated with Leonard's sharp handwriting pointing out inconsistencies between the association's claimed authority and the actual recorded deeds of the properties. There were letters from residents who had complained of being fined for infractions they never committed, some of whom later sold their homes under pressure to buyers connected to the same investment groups. Most damning of all was a set of maps not unlike the one Daniel had unearthed, each with sections marked in red, labeled Phase 1, Phase 2, and so on, spanning nearly the entire neighborhood and beyond, suggesting a systematic campaign to absorb independent properties into the association's control and transfer them to outside hands. For hours he pored over the documents, piecing together patterns the way he once pieced together structures from beams and trusses. The names Robert Hale and others appeared repeatedly, always attached to properties that had changed hands under questionable circumstances, and the handwriting that filled the signatures bore the same telltale uniformity he had observed in his own. Notices. This was no accident of clerical error. It was fraud executed with cold precision, a machinery designed to erase identities and replace them with fabricated owners until the paper trail outweighed the living truth. As he studied Leonard's notes, Daniel felt the strange stirrings of companionship, as though the late lawyer had reached across the years to guide him, to place tools in his hands, and for the first time in weeks he felt less alone in the battle. The following day, determined to verify what he had learned, Daniel drove into the county recorder's office with a folder of Leonard's documents tucked under his arm. The clerk, a middle-aged man accustomed to routine requests, grew visibly uneasy as Daniel laid the papers out and asked for confirmation of the property transfers. At first, he was met with the usual bureaucratic indifference, but when Daniel pressed, pointing to the repeated use of the same notary signatures and the suspicious clustering of sales to a single investment entity, the clerk sighed and lowered his voice, admitting that he had noticed irregularities himself but had been told by superiors not to interfere. He whispered that files had gone missing from archives, and when Daniel asked who had taken them, the clerk only shook his head, muttering that sometimes men arrived late in the evening with official-looking badges and left with boxes of records, and no one dared question them. Driving back, Daniel felt the air thick with inevitability, yet within that inevitability was also his first true advantage. Confirmation, however quiet, that the fraud was not only real, but already known, whispered about among those who lacked the power to oppose it. He now possessed not just suspicion but documented proof, a paper trail spanning years, a legacy preserved by Leonard Klein and delivered by Martha with a kind of reluctant courage. The knowledge weighed heavy, for it meant the conspiracy was deeper than he had feared, but it also fortified him, because unlike the counterfeit inspectors who thrived on intimidation and secrecy, Daniel now had light to cast into the shadows. That night, as he sat at his drafting table surrounded by files, he heard again the low purr of the black sedan outside, its headlights sweeping once across the walls before extinguishing. But this time, instead of shrinking back into the dark, Daniel rose, stepped to the window and stared directly into the night, refusing to move until the engine finally receded. He knew the battle was far from over, yet for the first time he felt not just hunted but armed, holding in his possession the pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, could expose the machinery threatening to erase him. It was the midpoint, the fulcrum upon which everything would pivot. And though the danger would only escalate from here, Daniel Mercer no longer stood merely as a solitary widower defending memories, but as a man who held within his grasp the fragile, but undeniable beginnings of truth. The days that followed his discovery of Leonard Klein's files were heavy with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air around Daniel's land, as though invisible wires had been strung across the property lines, humming with anticipation of a confrontation that could no longer be delayed. The sense of vigilance that had once been a habit now became necessity, for he knew that by reading those documents, by piecing together the fraud and giving it form, he had crossed from being a passive target into becoming a genuine obstacle, and men who operated in shadows did not tolerate obstacles for long. The black sedan no longer appeared only at night or on the periphery, but began to circle openly, sometimes slowing in the lane, sometimes parking at a distance long enough for Daniel to feel the weight of unseen eyes, before vanishing again as if to remind him that escape was impossible. The first direct escalation came on a damp evening when he returned from town with groceries, the bags resting heavy on the passenger seat. As he turned onto the gravel drive, his headlights caught two figures standing at the gate, not in suits this time, but in dark jackets, their postures casual yet charged with the unmistakable posture of men who did not intend to move. He stopped the truck several feet back, the engine idling, and waited for them to step aside. But they did not, and after a long minute he turned off the ignition and stepped out into the cool air. One of the men, younger, with a narrow jaw and restless hands, pulled from his jacket a folded document and held it out through the bars of the gate. "Final order," he said, his voice carrying no trace of courtesy. Daniel took it, unfolded it beneath the dim glow of the truck's headlights, and saw again the name Robert Hale, printed boldly across the top, attached now not only to his property but to a newly fabricated history of ownership that implied Daniel was nothing more than a trespasser. When he looked up, the man smiled thinly and added, "We can solve this without dragging it out, but if you keep pretending, you're going to force things you can't undo." Daniel's reply was measured, almost too calm for the moment. "You've made a mistake, and you know it. This land is mine. It always has been, and no counterfeit page will change that." The man shrugged, as if Daniel's defiance was exactly what he expected, and the older one beside him, broad-shouldered and silent until now, stepped forward just close, enough for Daniel to catch the scent of tobacco on his jacket. "Paper has power," the older man said flatly, "more than memories, more than stubbornness. If the record says you don't belong, then soon enough you don't." Without another word, they turned and walked back toward the sedan parked in the shadows of the trees, leaving Daniel holding the false document in his hand like a summons from a court that did not exist. The pressure did not end there. The following morning he found the side gate leading to his orchard unlatched, though he knew he had secured it the night before, and in the soft earth near the apple trees were boot prints that did not belong to him. They had entered not to steal or vandalize, but to send a message. Your boundaries mean nothing. He repaired the latch, cleaned the prints, and added the discovery to his growing archive, yet he felt the unease coil tighter inside him, because the violation was no longer theoretical. They were moving from intimidation by paper to intimidation by presence, eroding the invisible line between his world and theirs. It was Martha who steadied him in those days, arriving one evening with a flask of coffee and sitting on his porch as dusk settled across the fields. She told him that years ago Leonard had predicted exactly this progression, that once the association's manufactured debts failed to force compliance, they resorted to physical pressure, calculated intrusions meant to exhaust the will before the body. Daniel listened in silence, his jaw tight, until she reached across and set her hand gently on his arm, saying that solitude was no shield now, and that whatever he chose to do next, he would not be alone in it. Her quiet strength, drawn from years of surviving loss, lent him a measure of calm, but even as they spoke, the sound of an engine rolling slowly down the lane cut through the twilight, and when they turned their heads, they saw the sedan pause once. More at the gate before retreating into the distance. The next escalation came 2 nights later. Daniel was awakened by the sharp glare of headlights flooding his bedroom window, a beam too steady to be accidental. He rose, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The sedan was there again, positioned deliberately in front of the gate. This time the men stepped out, not carrying papers but standing with their hands visible as though to suggest they needed none. The younger one called out, "Mr. Mercer, it's late and this doesn't need to drag on. Sign the transfer and go back to your quiet life." "No one has to get hurt." Daniel's reply was firm and steady. "You're trespassing, and you're finished here." "Leave." The older man chuckled darkly, shaking his head, and muttered, "You still think this is about you." "You haven't seen the list." They returned to their car without further words, but the implication lingered. This was not an isolated act, but part of a campaign that stretched across names and lands far beyond his fence line. By dawn, Daniel's resolve had hardened into something sharper than resistance. He knew the second escalation was not a bluff, but the beginning of open siege, and though he felt the weight of solitude pressing on him, he also carried the files, the maps, and the whispered confirmations from the county clerk as a kind of armor. They wanted him to surrender, to collapse under the quiet suffocation of their presence. But Daniel Mercer had not built his home and his life to abandon them at the first push. They had crossed from shadow into his world, and in doing so they had awakened something in him that even grief had never extinguished: the refusal to yield. The night the siege finally broke began without incident, the air heavy with the damp stillness that precedes a storm, and Daniel had almost convinced himself that perhaps the men had tired of their game, that the silence was a reprieve, though deep down he knew silence in such matters was never mercy but preparation. He sat at his drafting table surrounded by Leonard Klein's files, his lamp throwing a warm circle of light across the paper while the rest of the house remained in shadow, when the low hum of an engine carried faintly through the walls. He rose without haste, walked to the window, and parted the curtain just enough to see the black sedan parked once more at the gate, headlights extinguished but its shape unmistakable against the pale gravel. 3 men stood outside this time. Not 2, their outlines sharp in the silver wash of the moon, and even from a distance Daniel felt the gravity of their presence. He did not move to meet them immediately. Instead, he took the time to place the files back into their box, set the box beside the door, and pull on his coat, his movements deliberate, as though he were an architect again preparing to present a plan he knew would be challenged. When he stepped outside, the night air clung to his skin and the gravel crunched beneath his boots, each step echoing louder than it should. The men waited in silence until he drew close to the gate, and then the tall one with slicked hair stepped forward and held up yet another document, his voice sharp and confident. "This is the last time we come quietly. Sign it, Mercer. Make this simple." Daniel stared at the page and then back into the man's eyes, his reply calm but edged with steel. "Forgery does not make you owners. It makes you criminals." For the first time, the man's composure cracked, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He shoved the document against the bars as though forcing it into Daniel's hands, and the younger one muttered, "Enough of this. Let's just move him out now." The air thickened, the threat no longer veiled, and Daniel felt the tension coil tight in his chest. But before the moment could fracture into violence, the quiet lane behind the sedan erupted in the sudden glare of headlights. Not one, but 2 vehicles sweeping into view, larger and darker than the sedan, their engines carrying the weight of authority. Doors swung open with practiced precision, and men in plain clothes but with unmistakable posture stepped out. Badges flashed briefly in the moonlight, voices sharp and commanding. Federal agents, step away from the vehicle. Hands visible. Now the transformation was instantaneous. The 3 so-called inspectors froze, their arrogance dissolving into disbelief as the agents closed in with the swift efficiency of men long accustomed to compliance. Daniel stood motionless as orders filled the night. Hands behind your back, face the car, do not move. The agents pressed the men against the sedan, cuffing them with metallic clicks that cut through the silence, and one of the younger ones muttered under his breath, "You don't understand. You don't know who you're interfering with." An agent replied, "Coldly, we know enough. You're done." Within moments, the 3 men were secured, their counterfeit documents scattered across the gravel, their posturing reduced to nothing but slumped shoulders and clenched jaws. Daniel did not speak until one of the agents approached him, asking his name and requesting to see identification. And when Daniel presented his license, the agent nodded with the brief courtesy of a man balancing efficiency and respect. "We've been tracking this operation for months," the agent explained, his voice low enough not to carry beyond the gate. "These men are part of a larger scheme: fake inspectors, forged transfers, property seizures across the state. We had reason to believe they'd make a move here, but we needed them caught in the act." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his body in a way that felt almost foreign, and nodded without reply because words in that moment seemed too small to contain the storm that had just broken. The agents loaded the men into the vehicles, the gravel spitting beneath their tires as they turned back down the lane, and for the first time in weeks the night settled into a silence that was not menace, but relief. Daniel remained by the gate long after the taillights vanished, his breath visible in the cool air, his hands still trembling slightly though he forced them into stillness. The false inspectors were gone, their arrogance shattered by real authority, but he knew the battle was not over. Men like that were never the end of the design, only the visible edge of something deeper. Yet standing there in the quiet, the knowledge that their charade had been broken, that their threats had been reduced to cuffs and silence, filled him with a rare certainty. The land still stood, and so did he. The days after the arrests passed in a strange quiet that felt almost unnatural to Daniel, as though the air itself needed time to remember how to be still again, and he moved through his home and across his land with a caution that slowly gave way to a tentative sense of relief. The federal agents had returned briefly, asking him for copies of Leonard Klein's files, taking photographs of the counterfeit documents, and promising that the evidence would support a larger case already in motion. And though Daniel knew promises from officials were often fragile, he could see in their precise questions and steady tone that this was no longer a private battle carried on in shadows, but a matter drawn into the light of law. The black sedan never returned, and the absence of its silent orbit around his property was like a weight lifting from his chest, though the grooves its tires had carved into the gravel remained as faint scars, reminders of how close he had come to losing everything. Martha visited often during those weeks, sometimes with small offerings of food, sometimes with nothing more than her presence, and their conversations, once sparse and formal, grew into longer talks that stretched into dusk. She told him more about Leonard's suspicions, about the way he had felt the pressure years before, and how it had frustrated him to die with his work unfinished, and Daniel realized that in a way he had become the continuation of a fight that had begun long before the false inspectors arrived at his gate. He no longer felt like a solitary widower guarding his land in isolation, but part of a chain of resistance that connected neighbors, stories, and memory, and that realization carried a quiet strength. The house, once a sanctuary tinged with grief, began to feel different as well. The files stacked on his drafting table no longer seemed like relics of paranoia, but like proof of his endurance, and when he walked the orchard in the cool mornings, he felt not the watchful presence of intruders, but the steady return of peace. The land remained his, the home remained standing, and he himself remained unbroken. For the first time in many years, Daniel opened his gates not to those who would take from him, but to those who shared in the relief of survival. And when his neighbors gathered quietly to thank him for standing firm, he understood that his struggle had preserved more than memories. It had safeguarded the community itself from being erased. The fight had scarred him, but it had also rebuilt him, and in the silence of the restored evenings, Daniel Mercer finally allowed himself to breathe.